I just don't allow others' smallness define my, worldviews or where I think I can, what I think I can accomplish.
Hey everyone, I'm Dominique, and this is a series called Exploring Leadership, where I connect with leaders virtually and go on a journey to explore their experience, learns, and insights. Today, I have the pleasure of chatting with Lynette Perez. Lynette is an attorney in San Antonio, Texas. She's one of 8 children, where for part of her childhood, she resided in Germany and Italy. In 1985, she graduated from Notre Dame with a bachelor's in business. Lynette attended the University of Oregon Graduate School of Journalism and had a 2-year career in journalism. In 1989, Lynette was crowned Miss Oregon, which I would love to find room to talk about that. Later, she received a master's degree in public administration in 1998 from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and in 1999 was the first woman elected to a city council ward in the history of Las Vegas, Nevada. In 2004, Lynette was appointed as a Clark County Commissioner and served until 2006. After her time in politics, Lynette authored a memoir, Finding God in Sin City, A Woman's Journey from Losing It All to Discovering Life's True Riches. In 2008, she moved to Texas and returned to school, receiving her Doctor of Jurisprudence in 2012 from St. Mary's University School of Law. Lynette has taught both constitutional and criminal law, and in 2018 was awarded the Future Legends in the Law Award by the San Antonio Black Lawyers Association. I know Lynette from our time of attending the same church in Las Vegas in the early 2000s when she was serving out her political term, and I was an aspiring Christian rock star. Over the years, I have continued to follow Lynette's journey through our social networks and have been inspired by her work from afar. I'm tremendously looking forward to this conversation to explore Lynette's unique journey and leadership experiences and hear about her learns and insights along the way. So Lynette, welcome.
Great to be here and so great to see you.
Yes, so great to see you as well. Thank you so much for making time for me today. Well, are you ready to jump into some questions?
I am ready.
Awesome.
Looking forward to it.
Great, me too. All right, so in reviewing your experiences, as I just read your introduction, you have had incredible career ambitions, and it's evident that you've been extremely ambitious and have placed yourself in positions to have influence and impact. Being one of 8 children living in different countries, how did your childhood influence that ambition, if at all?
Well, first and foremost, one thing that I know for certain, growing up an Army brat and having a scenario where most of my life, I lived, we were moving every 2 to 3 years into different locations. I can tell you unequivocally, it made me a very adaptable person. And also the benefit of having grown up in a different culture, a couple of things is that when you're an American living in a foreign country, we're all the minority, okay? Yeah. So, it didn't matter if you were, Black, white, Hispanic, Native American, Asian. If you were an American in a foreign country, we were all a minority. But on the other hand, too, living in military settings, is that I grew up always in very diverse settings. Okay. I tell my husband, who is, Puerto Rican, by having Puerto Rican parents, that I grew up with more Puerto Rican friends than he did, because there were, on the Army base, there are many people from Puerto Rico who were in the United States Army. My dad's first sergeant was Puerto Rican. I have all my life, I've had friends whose, one parent was German. I've had parents who, friends whose parents were French, Korean, Japanese, Jewish, you name it. I grew up around so many cultures. So for me, I've always been able to find some common ground with anyone. If I just have enough conversation with that person, I will find that we have something in common. And so that, I believe, is, was a benefit for me, that I just became someone that could go into, I guess, new settings, new situations, and could quickly adapt to that, because that was always the story of my upbringing. I always had to make new friends.
Yeah.
Every 2 to 3 years. I always had to, start a new school or a new team, whatever the case may be, as a kid. And, by the time I was 18, I had literally been to probably 20 different countries
Wow.
before I was 18 years old. So my viewpoint always was, multinational, growing up. And having been exposed to so many different cultures, I had been in places where women were already like the chancellor, of that country, or they were the prime minister, of a country that, and I'm talking about going back to the 70s,
Wow.
in the 80s, there were women heads of state in Europe.
Wow.
And places that I've traveled, heads, whether it be Indira Gandhi, type, or Angela Merkel in Germany. So for me, having grown up in Europe and seeing women, running, even the Queen, was, I remember, when I was a little girl going to England for her diamond jubilee.
Oh,
She
wow.
was on the throne for 25 years, but look how long she's still on the throne.
Yeah.
But just to see, so for me, to see women at the top, at the pinnacle, having grown up the way I did, I just assumed that that was the way it was supposed to be. Now, coming back to the United States, I had to kind of acclimate that that wasn't the way it was right out the gate, as far as, we still haven't had a woman, president, but
Right.
we have, I've witnessed, even in my life, women who are, United States senators, leaders in Congress, speaker of the, so all of that I have been able to witness in my life. But like I said, it was going on in the 70s in Europe.
Yeah.
And so I'm very grateful to have had that exposure at a young age.
Yeah, that's an incredible insight. And I could see how that could shape how you approach different positions, or even jobs or roles, without
and I should
having.
also say how we kind of got to Europe to begin with. My biological parents had divorced when I was young, and my mother is probably one of the biggest risk takers I've known in my life, in that, in 1972, as a divorced woman who had never been out of the country before, accepted a job in Europe.
Wow.
Okay. And so we were in a different reality when a lot of the South was still dealing with kind of segregation-ish, even though legal segregation was still over. But, you still had many communities where, there was a black side of town, or the black side of the track, or whatnot. And so we weren't really exposed to that. We grew up in a totally different type of military setting. My mom remarried a military person. And so, I, from that young age on, had this military environment. But the fact that my mother, who had grown up in, segregated settings, thought enough to get her 4 children at the time out of America.
Wow.
That was a very pivotal
Yeah.
gutsy thing to do, and really, I think set us on a path that we would not have if my mom had never taken that risk.
Wow. Yeah. It's incredible that she had the foresight to do that, and
Yes,
to allow you all that unique perspective that you probably wouldn't have had in the States. When
exactly.
did you return back to the United States?
So I personally returned when it was time for me to go to University of Notre Dame in the early 80s. But my mother and stepdad, who basically was my dad, they were still in Europe until like the mid 90s.
Wow.
So even though I was living in Las Vegas and I was a young adult, whenever I wanted to visit my parents, I would catch a plane and fly to Europe to see them. And so, so I had I came back at age 18, but I would frequently travel back to Europe for a good another 10 to 15 years until they decided to retire back in the United States, and they retired here in San Antonio.
Oh, wow. Good. So you're close to them now. That's great.
Yes.
That's wonderful. I love that. Thank you so much for sharing a little bit of the history, right? To kind of really the moments that shaped you, I'm sure, in a lot of your mentalities. So I'm really interested in some of this question around your political career. So currently, with the state of our country, I've personally become far more interested in the world of politics than I have ever been. I think,
I think everyone has.
yeah, majority of my life, I've probably been more on the ignorant side, and I've chosen to definitely educate myself a little bit more currently. But I'm curious to hear from you about where the switch occurred, because you went to school for journalism and then you went into politics. So what led to that transition?
Well, all of this has been somewhat organic. When I think and reflect back, on it, and that, as a reporter, I used to have to interview elected officials and interview police chiefs and interview judges. All the worlds that I deal with today, my first exposure with the courthouse, my first exposure really to criminal justice and all of that came about as a news reporter. And so when I first got to Las Vegas, I actually interviewed to be a reporter and considered doing it. But I had found that they wanted to almost have me start, like when you start off as a new journalist, they have you work kind of the police beat, crimes occur and you write the police story. And that's kind of where you cut your teeth in journalism, most people starting off.
Okay.
And when I got to Las Vegas, I had already become a feature writer. I've always enjoyed writing. And back in 1990, still working in Texas, I had become a award-winning journalist for my news feature writing. And so when I came back to Nevada, or when I moved to Nevada, had never lived there before, I interviewed at the Review Journal, and it was like they wanted me to go back to the police beat. And I felt that I was beyond that it was like going back to square one, where I was already at square 7 or 8 at that point. Even though it had been a short amount of time, I had progressed. So I put a few other feelers out before I accepted or rejected that job. And I got a public relations community marketing position offer at the University of Nevada School of Medicine. And I accepted that. And as fate would have it, there were discussions between the city of Las Vegas to help, with the School of Medicine and the city of Las Vegas, to help develop more clinical programs, clinical offerings for the community in the northwestern portion of Las Vegas. And I was always involved in those meetings with the city manager, with department heads or whatnot. And long story short, when they decided to add and hire another assistant city manager for Las Vegas, I was asked to apply for the job.
Wow.
I applied for the job. I was offered the job, and then I was a staffer at City Hall for 3-4 years. I left, went to UNLV, and I had an opportunity, as I was working as a staffer at City Hall, my role was to implement the policies of the mayor and city council. And I enjoyed and I learned a lot as an implementer.
Yeah.
But I found that I also had ideas of my own as to how things should be implemented, but that wasn't my role. I was not an elected person. So if I wanted to be the one who would have an ultimate say to, push the button as to approving projects, hiring department heads and all of that, then I needed to be a city council person myself. And so I left, but then I came back first as an appointed person because there was a vacancy on the city council. But then I ran, and actually, even when I was appointed, I made Las Vegas history because there had never been a councilwoman in the history of Las Vegas.
Wow.
And I was reelected by the people outright to keep the position. And I had that position for 5 years.
That's incredible. I love it. It seems to tie into your upbringing, right? You're talking about, you have this opportunity, you're watching stuff happen, and you have all these ideas, I'm sure, that are stemming from your own experiences in other places where you've probably seen them work really well,
right.
or not,
right.
or not well. And you had the ability
exactly.
to offer that insight. And it sounds almost serendipitous in a way that you were able to
and it
be
all,
in that
like
setting.
I said, it's all organic. If you were to say, in 1989, when I was winning Miss Oregon, that a decade later, you'd be a history maker, you'd be, sitting on a city council in a city like Las Vegas that I had never even been to at that point in my life. And you would be approving major hotels, major neighborhoods. I mean, most of Summerlin, that, which was then, and it still may be today, the largest master plan community in America.
Wow, I didn't know it was that large.
That, that you're involved with the planning of that, and I would have said, no way would I be doing, that kind of thing. But I was given in a 10-year window, and you and I, before we went on air, talked about how fast a decade can fly by.
Right.
And it's just really interesting that, almost every 10 years, there's been something major happening in my, life that it's like, you almost start looking forward to, okay, what will happen in the next 10 years?
I love that. I love that perspective, just of excitement, right? Of time continuing to move forward, because what potential, exists in the future. I'm really interested in hearing, all these different roles that you had, and now you're a lawyer, right? And I'm curious to hear which role in your career entirety has tested and grown your leadership the most.
Well, I would go back first to the city council position being the first. And that, if you can imagine, it's like, and I need to rewind a little bit to, for this to even make sense. So right before I went to City Hall, I was working at UNLV for the president of UNLV, a woman by the name of Carol Harder, who was the first woman president in the history of the University of Nevada system. There had never been a woman to be a university president prior to Carol Harder at UNLV. And so she, working closely with her on a day-to-day basis, it was, I heard so many of her anecdotal stories about her being a first.
Mm.
So she had been a vice president, a university vice president before she became a university president. And she was someone who had accomplished a lot of responsibility at a relatively young age. So I think she had her doctorate when she was 30 years old.
Wow.
And then shortly thereafter was named this vice president of a major university. And she noticed that they would refer to all the men as Dr. Smith, Dr. Jones, Dr. whatever that man's name, but they wanted to refer to her as Carol.
Mm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And she had to nip that in the bud.
Yeah.
So I remember her sharing that story with me, and it made an impression on me. So when I got to City Hall in 1999, I was the first woman. And I had been there before as a staffer where everyone referred to me as Lynette.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And everyone was on a first name basis as a staffer. And so my assistant, who had been my assistant previously when I was the assistant city manager, and now she's back as my assistant as an elected official, she says, the people want to know what to call you. How do we address you? Now, I already knew they refer to all the men, Mayor Goodman, Councilman Brown, Councilman McDonald, Councilman Reese. No, you're going to call me Councilwoman McDonald.
Yeah.
At the time, that was my married name.
Mm-hmm.
And so if I had not worked for a woman who had already dealt with that issue, I probably wouldn't have known how to handle that issue, or had the I guess, courage to demand that they give me the same respect as the men. Yeah. And I'm talking about on the floor that we were in, they didn't even have a proper women's toilet on that floor. They were so used to being, they had a urinal.
Wow.
They didn't have anything for, sanitary disposals.
Yeah.
Because, now Jan Jones had been the first woman on the city council as the mayor, but she had a private, little setup in the mayor's suite. Okay. But for the council members, I was like, okay, this urinal, you better get the building department, the custodian or somebody, they're going to have to retrofit.
Wow.
The bathroom.
Yeah.
Okay. So I had to, the women that have come behind me, didn't have to worry about that. I had to get that stuff straightened out for everyone coming behind me. Okay. And also knowing that, I had to be prepared. I had to, have my ducks in a row, so that, and also just demand that I would get the same amount of, staff time and response as the men up there. And, yes, sometimes that would make me more of a target, at times, but at the end of the day, I was able to get things done for the people who elected me. And at the end of the day, that's all that really mattered.
Absolutely. It is incredible to hear how you took advantage of the opportunity of being the first to set expectations of what it could look like for future generations, really. And,
right. and like I said, I have to, and I have told her this many times, and even to this day, she will say, Lynette, you can call me Carol. But even to this day, I still refer to her as Dr. Harder, because to me, that made such an impression, on me. And she earned that, respect. And even though she's retired now and she says I can call her Carol, I still call her Dr. Harder.
That's a great story. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's such an important lesson in that, especially for women leaders. And I know for you around that time, what was that, 1999 initially when you joined the council.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, you're at the millennia at this point, and we're just now setting expectations for what it's like having women there. And it
Yes.
seems pretty late in the game, if I'm completely honest, but
Well, I thought 1999 was, way late. I mean, you think of Las Vegas, I think was founded in 1908 or, in the early 1900s. And in 1999, it took this Army brat that wasn't even born and raised there to move into there. And, in many ways, Las Vegas had this reputation of being the Mississippi of the West. And there was a lot of segregation back in the day. But I think another thing that I helped in my role as a city councilwoman and my contribution was that I was the first elected official in Clark County that was Black, who did not represent the West Las Vegas predominantly Black community. And before me, there were Black city council members, state assembly, state senators, but they all represented the one geographic area. And there were many in the media that would say that, when I was, well, she got appointed, but there's no way she can get reelected. Well, I just refused to allow myself to be boxed in, because I knew if I went to the constituents and said, I'm a former assistant city manager, I'm a Notre Dame alumna, I've got a master's degree in public administration. Do you want me to be your voice on the city council? And guess what? It was greater than 70% of them. Wow. I never had runoffs. I always would win these elections outright. And so when other people of color, I believe, saw me winning outside of what was the historical areas, then people started running in other portions of the county. And so today you've had state senators and state assembly people and members of Congress who are Black in Las Vegas that didn't necessarily represent the West Las Vegas. They still obviously have those representations, but they're more. Sure. It was a paradigm shift that if you're qualified, go and take your message wherever people are willing to listen to it and see what happens.
That's awesome. Yeah, because here you are, right? You just showed up and you're like, I'm just going to do this thing, right? This seems to be normal everywhere else in the world, so here I am.
Yeah, exactly. I just wouldn't, and I'm still that way. I just don't allow others' smallness define my, worldviews or what I think I can accomplish. Because the reality is, I've talked to, world leaders and national leaders or whatnot, and guess what? We're as smart as they are. Okay, it's just, not that I'm picking on anyone, but I lived in South Bend, Indiana for 4 years, and the mayor of South Bend can run for president of the United States. Well, I was a county commissioner in a county that had more population than Mr. Buttigieg. Okay. I had responsibility of one of the busiest airports in America. McCarran International is one of the busiest. A level 1 trauma center, University Medical Center. Okay. So I approved billion-dollar projects. There ain't no billion-dollar projects in South Bend. I can tell you that. Okay.
Yeah.
So, not that I'm going to say that I'm going to run for president of the United States, but there are people who did run for president of the United States that don't even have my resume.
Yeah.
Okay. And so if they can run, maybe in the future I might run. Okay.
Yeah, why
but
not?
I'm not going to let someone else's, small thinking, whatever, say, oh, well, you can't do X, Y, or Z. when there are people doing X, Y, and Z that don't even have the experiences that I've had.
Yeah.
So, you just have to, don't let anyone box you in.
I love that. It's a great mentality to have. Let's jump into the next question. Obviously, in our lives, right, we have our ups and downs. Before we start talking, you mentioned, right, the peaks and valleys, and it's important to share both of those things. And so I'm curious to hear from you if there is a specific failure that was an important learning lesson in your journey that you're willing to share with us.
Well, there are many, but one of the great quotes I read somewhere is I never lose. I either win or I learn. Okay. And how I ended up in Texas was that I lost an re-election in 2006. I was a Clark County commissioner, and there was this allegation that I didn't live where I said I lived when I filed my election papers. I was going through a divorce. The lesson I learned from just that part, even before I get deeper into the story, is that when your personal life is in chaos and your personal life is in chaos, that's not a good time to be involved in any type of public service or putting yourself out there for an election. And and so hindsight being 2020, I probably should not have run for re-election, but I was the incumbent. I had things that I still wanted to accomplish in that role, but my personal life was jacked up.
Wow.
Okay. And so things spiraled because of what was going on in my personal life. And so, long story short, the police union at the time, they had me followed and had all this videotape of me allegedly not living where I said I lived. And what I learned about the media at that point in my, having been a reporter, I saw that there was like this evolution of reporting facts, challenging facts versus, if it bleeds, it leads, and just this whole, personal destruction type of media that, if you can tear people down, then that's what's going to make the front page news. And I think it's gotten even worse even since 2006. But I jokingly say I was forever grateful to O.J. Simpson when he got into his little drama in Las Vegas and got arrested, because he kicked me off the front page of the newspaper before the juice. I was the headline, okay?
Wow.
And so I will forever be grateful to O.J. For that. But long story short, I went through the season where I lost the election. I was relatively young still. I had young children. I had gone through a divorce. I no longer had a career. And I'm like, what am I going to do for the rest of my life? And my folks said, you should come home. Okay, now, when you've left home at 18 and now you're in your early 40s and your parents are saying, come home, you don't just agree and say, oh, yeah, that's a great idea. You're like, no, I don't know about that. I was very reluctant about that. And I didn't give an immediate response, to the invitation to leave Nevada, just go to Texas and start fresh. But I ultimately just came to the conclusion the only thing that was keeping me from taking up my parents' offer was two things: pride and shame. Okay. And those were two things that I needed to swallow to move forward with the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I took them up, and, somewhat the rest is history,
Mm-hmm.
but it was a pivotal decision that making that move and leaving Las Vegas, like the Sheryl Crow song goes, that made the world a difference. And I honestly didn't know what I was going to do when I got here. I honestly had no clue. But then I remember that 20 years earlier, when I was in my early 20s, I had been accepted to law school. I just chickened out. I literally chickened out.
Wow.
And I had chickened out because I think my older siblings, I had two older siblings that had gone to law school, and they were very successful. And I was like, oh, we don't need another lawyer in the family. So I just did this, detour in government for the most part, where every day I worked with lawyers. People even thought I was a lawyer, but I wasn't. I just worked with lawyers on a daily basis. And so finally I said to myself, well, I'll apply and see what this law school, if it works out, I'll get accepted and see what happens. And I applied, I got accepted to 3 different law schools. The 20 years earlier, it had been 3 law schools. In my 40s, it was 3 different law schools. And I decided to basically stay put so that I would have the support of my parents to help me while I was going through law school, to help me with my children. And so that was a pivotal, but if I had not gone through that, what I call a desert season in my life, I would not be where I'm at today, because I probably would have never left.
Yeah, and was that 2008?
That was 2008.
And so that's when really the whole world was kind of crumbling down, right? With the whole housing
real estate
economy.
market crashed, and
all of that
economy crash and all of that. And so it was a pivotal time. And I started off just here, subteaching while I was going through that year of, studying for the LSATs. And that in many ways exposed me to the type of law that I now practice, because I found that I enjoyed working with young people, and just being in their world. That really started something, planted a seed in me. And I almost went on a detour and became a school teacher. And the very day that I said, you know what, I'll just go gather all this information as to what I need to do to get a teaching certificate. And I took the day, did all this research, gathered all this information. I went to the mailbox, and there was my first law admission letter. And I said, okay, I'll stick with plan A. Before I go on another detour here, let me stick with plan A.
That's awesome. That's incredible. So thank you for sharing that. I want to transition a little bit into current times and things that are happening in our world right now, right? So we are obviously in 2020 in the midst of a pandemic, as well as an awakening around racial injustice. And I'm curious to hear how this current season has evolved or impacted your leadership, or even just your perspective.
Well, my perspective, I can share with you that the first national tragedy I remember in my life was the assassination of Martin Luther King. I remember 1969, even though I was little, or 68, I was little, and I just remember all hell broke loose when the news came out that Martin Luther King had been shot and killed in Memphis, Tennessee. I remember riots breaking out. I remember chaos, looting, fires, you name it. I just remember that as a small child. It burned an impression in my mind, even though I was probably just 5 years old at the time. And then you fast forward to 2020, and it just really, to have 50 years, go by in your life and to see similar images. And and now, I'm the parent of people that are, like a Arbery age or Breonna, Taylor age. And, I always just assumed growing up that these issues would kind of get resolved before my kids were out there as the young adults or teenagers, young adults in the world. And so it was, I still can't watch the George Floyd video. I just can't watch it. Okay. It just is so problematic. And then as working in the criminal justice field on a day-to-day basis, you just, there are just things that as a lawyer that even if George Floyd hypothetically was doing something illegal, there's no offense that he did that takes you straight to anywhere remotely near a death penalty situation or immediately to death. I mean, we have due process and laws that you're supposed to go to.
Yeah.
And so a lot of the things that had gotten me sideways with the police union in Las Vegas that I was talking about 20 years ago are still the issues today. I had been talking about 20 years ago that there's got to be a way to fire bad cops. Okay. There's got to be a way that the public, as a lawyer, if I'm a bad lawyer, you can go onto the state bar's website and the public has access to my disciplinary records.
Wow.
They can see that if I'm someone that's had grievances or has been sanctioned by the state bar or whatever, that's public access. Okay. You don't have that for police officers. You can look up doctors and see has their license been suspended, or a psychologist, has their license been suspended? Are they in good standing with their licensing authority? So they're all professions have good and bad.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
In my profession, there are bad lawyers, but there's mechanisms for the public to know that that's a bad lawyer that you're dealing with before you hire them.
Yeah.
And so there has been a problem with what we call qualified immunity, where the municipalities can't be sued when their police officers do unlawful things. These are things that I was talking about as a city councilwoman in Las Vegas in 1999.
Wow.
And there's still the same issue. Okay.
Yeah.
And so I have had many a Las Vegan, comment on my Facebook page and say, oh, now I kind of get why they didn't now the lights are going on. You were talking about these things in 1999 and 2000 and 2001 that now people in 2020 are finally, because of what happened in Minneapolis, are talking about. I said, yes, that is in fact that you have where the police chief or the sheriff can't fire someone because of what is in the contract.
Yep.
Okay. So these are things that I'm like, wow, I'm now starting to talk about again, but these are things that I was talking about literally 20 plus years ago, but now the light bulbs are finally starting to, go off, and people are saying, oh, now I kind of get it now. The big difference though today is technology.
Yeah.
I mean, you can have your own program. You don't need NBC or CBS. You are your own network now.
Yeah.
You have the technology, your microphone, your Zooming, your Facebook Living or whatever. And the biggest difference now is that people internationally are seeing what happened because of what the social media, the upside of social media has provided, is that not just people in Minneapolis or Texas or Nevada saw what happened to George Floyd. People in Amsterdam saw it. People in Berlin saw it. People in Mumbai saw it. People in Switzerland saw it. people in Japan saw it, and people were protesting all around the globe. That's the biggest difference now in the 20 years. And I think your generation is just a lot more empathetic and open to listen to other viewpoints.
Yeah.
You know, I'm toward the end of the baby boomer, and I just think that it's time for us to kind of pass the torch to the next generation, you know. And what's been real interesting the last several weeks, I've had more young women like yourself call me to interview me about leadership, about politics, whatever. You're now the third state, and you know, I've had East Coast, West Coast, and Midwest even contact me, and I just am encouraged that this generation coming up, you know, cares and gets things. Like when we say Black Lives Matter, it's not about any type of political statement. It's, you're just basically saying that
there's a
you know,
problem.
we want Black people to understand that they are valuable,
Yes.
you know, as well. It's not a political, so this is an aspirational, you know, statement.
That's right.
But even that has become like turned on it, you know, tried to made almost demonized.
Yeah.
You know,
politicized.
It's like, you know, politicized, you know, and it's like, well, no, if I say that, I'm not, I couldn't tell you who, there may be an organization with that name. I don't know anything about that organization. I've not sent any money to, or I couldn't tell you who their leaders are.
Sure.
But when I'm saying Black Lives Matter, it's not a political statement. It's an aspirational, you know, statement.
Yes.
Because, you know, if I can, as the lawyer, an officer of the courts, okay, that lives in a nice neighborhood, D.R. Horton home and all of that, if even I walk into a department store and get followed, okay, or, you know, there's problems, systematic, implicit, whatever, that, or if I walk into a court, even though a court is closed and because of the pandemic, but if I walked into a courthouse I had never appeared before, and I walk into the well of the court because I'm an officer of the court, my law license allows me to appear in every court in the state of Texas. But if I go to some remote location and I walk into the well of the court and the bailiff comes up to me and says, you know, you're needing to be on that side. And I said, no, I'm a lawyer, you know, that is because you just made an assumption.
Wow.
You know, because you're not, whatever. Okay, so these kind of things happen.
Yeah.
You know, my sister, who's a lawyer, she could tell you she had business in Alabama. You know, I'm talking about in 2020. You know, she's someone that has been a successful corporate Fortune 500 attorney that, you know, sits on boards of major corporations in America. And she just was out on a walk, and this cop car, you know, came around, you know, and was like watching, like, you know, almost as if she said that she continued walking, just speaking to herself, I belong here. I belong here.
Wow.
It's okay for me to be here, you know. But those are the kind of scenarios, you know, it's very easy to demonize, like the, you know, George Floyd's of the world. They can, you know, folks can try to say, well, he had all this criminal history or he was whatever. I just share what's happening to me and my siblings in 2020, because, you know, we grew up with parents. Okay, so check off that stereotype that you try to put on Black. Okay, you can't use that one on us. Okay, we're college educated. In fact, we all have advanced degrees. Okay, you can't put us in some, where they weren't educated. None of us have criminal records, so you can't put, you know. So if we still experience stuff, they grew up with mother, father, you know, economic advantages, where we work, you know, make good incomes, live in nice neighborhoods. If we have these situations happen to us, what's happening to the poor folk that, don't have education or know the law like we do.
Right.
Okay. So, trust me, I have my sister, one other situation where she was working as a lawyer in the White House at one time. She was a White House lawyer, West Wing type.
Wow.
Went to go rent an apartment. She had a Caucasian roommate. Caucasian roommate goes and was shown all these apartments in Washington, D.C. He says, you go and check out these apartments here, and if you like it, we'll go sign the lease. So when my sister got done with her day, she went to the apartment, and the leasing agent said, oh, no, we don't have any vacancies.
Wow.
And so my sister tells the roommate, I guess all of the apartments got leased this afternoon. They said, that sounds odd. So the roommate calls back and says, all the apartments you showed me earlier today are gone. Oh no, we still have the 3 apartments, da, 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 da.
Wow.
Okay. So that happened to my sister, who was a veteran, who was working in the White House. So if that kind of housing discrimination,
Mm-hmm.
so it's not just about just the political, we can go into, housing, we can
Yep.
go to healthcare,
Yep.
we can go into all these different areas and talk about disparities. And, but a lot of people of my generation, they feel safe in the way things are. They don't want to hear that this is what happens when I walk into Ann Taylor's store. Okay. Because they didn't have that experience. But I think the younger generation is all ears to say, well, if that happened to you, I believe you, and I want to hear, and what can we do together to make sure it didn't happen again? And I think that's the big difference, the generational vantage point that your generation brings, that you're not going to just let it go. You want to hear and want to be a part of the solution.
Yes, absolutely. I've had so many conversations and learned so much around this issue, and there's still a ton I don't know, but a couple of points that seem to kind of help all of this with timing make sense. Your point around generation, right? I do believe that socially, my generation, but even the younger generation, I'm 35 now. So, I had the gap where I grew up with technology, but when I was born, this technology didn't exist, right? And so we have the younger generation who they were born into this wild exposure to the world, right? Where somebody like you, this stuff already makes sense for so many reasons, right? Like you traveled the world, who you are, the things that you've done. And so you have that perspective. But these younger generation who have been born into this and can turn on their phone and watch somebody on the other side of the world and, to your point, empathize.
Yes.
It has changed this sociological perspective is so unique, and they get it. And I believe they will carry this. They will carry this, and it will come to fruition, and we will absolutely see change. I'm clearly very passionate about this.
I'm optimistic because of, the generations that are coming, behind me, that there's that empathy, and they aren't, challenged, or they're not afraid to have the difficult conversations.
Yes.
They're okay with being outside of your comfort zone a little, if it means that we all, come out ahead. I think so. There's just a lot of generational promise that makes me, optimistic to, be, at a place in life that I say, okay, it'll be interesting to see what goes down the next 20, 30 years and what unfolds. But I believe we're at a crossroads. I honestly don't know how this election is going to go down. But I do know that I just feel that we're at a intersection in history.
Agreed.
You know what that means we'll all, I guess, experience together. But I just believe we're at a critical intersection with all of the things from the social justice, the pandemic, now the economic, all of that just have come to a head.
Mm-hmm.
And it's going to be interesting.
Yeah. And, regardless of whether it happens within the next, 25 days, if there's change
Right.
there, or whether it's, to your point, 10 to 20 years down the road, I absolutely believe that the change is coming and it will come.
Yeah, it was all set in motion for certain in 2020,
Yes.
And how it unfolds, history will write itself. But I really believe that 100 years from now, that we'll still be talking about 2020.
I agree. Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful place to wrap up. Are you open to a couple rapid fire questions for fun?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So, I'm half Mexican and I love burritos. That's kind of my thing. And clearly you're in Texas. So the first question is, Mexican or Tex-Mex?
Tex-Mex.
Okay, cool. Favorite quote off the top of your head?
Favorite quote is, whether you think you can or think you can't, you're right.
Is that Henry Ford? I think it's Henry Ford.
I think it's a Henry Ford quote.
Yeah, no, I love that quote.
I think so. There's another one by Ziggy, that Ziggy cartoon, good judgment comes from experience. Experience comes from poor judgment.
Ooh, yeah, that's a great one. What's your typical Saturday?
Typical Saturday, sleeping in, watching HGTV, in my pajamas as long as possible, and then probably running errands to places like Kohl's, Home Depot. Tuesday morning is another one.
Nice. Sounds like a great Saturday. What's the last book you read?
The last book I read, actually, I reread the book of Exodus.
Wow. Okay.
I just found it kind of some parallels in what's going on in the world today.
I might go and do that as well. What's your biggest pet peeve?
My biggest pet peeve is, let's see, the biggest one. The biggest pet peeve, I would say, is when people don't vote and want to complain, but they didn't participate. Ooh. Then that's a really big pet peeve of mine. That's the other one is when people don't signal when they change lanes. That's another big pet peeve of mine.
Yes, I am in agreement with you there. Person you'd like to meet, dead or alive?
Person I would like to meet, I would love to have met Nelson Mandela.
That's awesome. Yeah. And finally, last question, where can people find out more about you?
You can go to my website, which is LynetteBoggs.com, and that's my law firm's website, but also a great way to find me. You can also find me on social media under Lynette Perez, my married name now, or attorney Lynette Boggs Perez, both on Instagram and on Facebook. So I have both personal pages as well as professional pages on Instagram and on Facebook.
It's awesome. Thank you, Lynette, again, so much for your time. This has been incredible, just hearing your insight, and I'm really excited to share it out to others.
Well, thank you so much for thinking of me, and it was so great catching up.